Hello. I'm not sure how well you can see this lovely little hat that I'm wearing. This is typical of a hat that would have been worn by ladies and girls during the time of the Revolutionary War. This little bonnet that would go over their head. So, speaking of ladies of the war, what you read on page 174 and 175 talked about different ways that women help support the war effort. A lot of the men had to go off to war. So I left jobs like being a carpenter, being a blacksmith, building ships, things like that, or even running the family farm. Women had to do that. So a lot of them stepped up into those roles to help take care of things and keep things going as normal as possible during a trying time such as a war. And it was a very difficult time for a lot of women too, but they did the best they could and they made the best of the situation. And they did well. Without women, who knows what else could have happened in the Revolutionary War? They helped the cause just as much as the men did. So the women were just as important as the women during this time period. But not only did some women help back home away from the war, several did help on the war front. Um, Sybil Ludington was nicknamed the female Paul Revere because she warned that the British were coming to attack Danbury, Connecticut. And you also read about Deborah Sampson. And Deborah is a very famous person that she really wanted to help the war effort. She wanted to be a part of the army, but you couldn't. At the time, it was only allowed for men to be a part of the army. So she disguised herself as a man. And the only reason she was discovered to be a man is she was wounded, and the doctor discovered that she was a female. And so then she left the army, and they were nice to her about it. They didn't put her in jail or anything like that, but they respected her. Another person famous for this was Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay. She had the nickname Molly Pitcher because she was at the battlefield, visiting her husband. And when soldiers were hurt, she would help bring them water. And when her husband was wounded, he was somebody that operated a cannon. She jumped in his place to help too. So that was something that Molly Pitcher did. And you also read about African Americans. At the time, African Americans were, of course, slaves. Some that were free were allowed to join as soldiers eventually because the colonies realized, okay, we need soldiers. We don't have enough. So about 5,000 African Americans joined to serve in the Continental Army. But they were forced to be in their own groups, their own regiments, as we call it, and all their officers were white. But they did try to fight for the freedom of the country, even though slavery would still exist in the country for many, many years after the Revolutionary War. It wouldn't end until 1865 at the end of the Civil War. But African Americans both helped on the battlefield and also as behind the scenes helping with other things. So the last page you read about was wartime shortages. Anytime there's war on, it can lead to some problems. And people themselves lead to these problems too. As I mentioned in another video, things like cloth, kettles, and tools that were made in British factories, well, they're not going to get those anymore because they are not trading with Great Britain anymore. So a lot of people realize that. They're like, you know what, we have all these goods, we can hoard them. When you hoard something, it means you get a bunch of it and you hide it. And then they thought, if we hide all these goods, we store them up, we can turn around and sell them for high prices. And that's something called profiteering. You're trying to make profiteering on something. And they could do this by the prices go way up. Let's just take, for example, Xbox One. I don't know what it's called, but when Xbox Ones first come out, call that the law of supply and the demand. The more demand for it, price goes up. The less demand for it, price goes down. Another thing that hurt during this time period was money. Now you can look on the screen here, and I have a picture of money. There's two different types of money here. We have one that's called the Continental Dollar. I'm trying to zoom. There we go. Now we talked about this in class a little bit. It's called the Continental. Back then, you had to have gold to give your paper money value. Well, Congress could not get taxes from these colonies, so they didn't have a lot of gold to back up their money. So Continentals were not very valuable. And if paper money is not very valuable, it's going to cost even more to get something. So this is what one of the words you read was inflation. Because the paper money wasn't worth a lot, it's going to cost more to get something. So inflation, prices go up. So one of the sayings became, well, that's not worth much Continental. Continentals, the paper form, a lot of soldiers thought, you know what, it is basically not very valuable. Just something better off to use as toilet paper. Whereas the coins, like you can see here, they had value because they were made out of silver typically, and that silver gave it value. So one thing I also want to show you on here is an example of a continental dollar from 1776. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but if you just Google continental coin, things like that, and if we were in class, I would also have had some paper money. This is stuff you can just Google continental money, continental coins, continental dollars, and it'll show you. Some other pictures I want to show you today. Here is coins. Now, one way they gave coins or gave change back is they'd actually split the coins into pieces. So if you wanted a $quarter, you would have to split the coin into quarters, so into fourths. And then they would weigh it to make sure that you're getting the right amount of money. So that's one way they gave change for coins. Like today, you just get other coins back. Then no, you just broke it into pieces. And one continental dollar can be broken into fourths. So that's one way that they gave change during that time period. Here are just some other things you might find that a soldier might use during this time period. Just a chair to sit on, either cooking coffee, plates, fork, knife, salt and pepper, and all those things could be right here. And this particular stuff belonged to George Washington. This is what he used. Also, another thing that was used during the Revolutionary War and many wars up to and after the Revolutionary War was drums and a fife or a flute right here. Drums would have been used to help with on the battlefield and stuff like that. So here is an example of a ship that would have been used during the time. So then, we need to go back. I accidentally clicked the wrong button there. Now, when notes were sent, they would seal an envelope like this. They would typically they could wax like this, melt the wax in this little device here, and then you would pour it onto the envelope, and then you'd have a stamp, maybe with something that was important to you, and you'd seal the envelope shut like that. So that's one way they sealed envelopes during this time period. Here's just an example of a compass from this time period. And one job that women or slaves did during this time period was spin cloth. So you take the wool and you put it on the spinning wheel to turn into a cloth, and now you can make anything, clothes, hats, whatever they might need at that time. Some different things that are going to be baked during this time period. You see, oranges aren't going to be baked, but bread, eggs, a lot of similar food that we have today. This is an old-fashioned toaster. You just put the pieces of bread in here and you would grill it. Now, or not grill it, you toast it. Ovens would usually be made out of brick or cement, and they would be heated with wood. So they put wood in the back of the fireplace to get it nice and warm. They would test this to make sure it was warm enough as they put their hand inside the oven. And if they could hold their hands there for 10 seconds or longer, it wasn't warm enough. If it was a little less than 10 seconds, it might have been too hot. So they're looking for a good oven temperature when they could put their hands in the brick for 10 seconds. Here's just some other tools they would have used in the oven. Just a large spatula and a large fork, large little spoon type thing there, so things like that. This is something that sugar would have been packed in. So it would have a nice little cone shape with the wrap around it. And then they didn't have electricity, so they would have everything would have been candles to see. That's a fake candle. You can tell by the bulb on top there. But here's an old-fashioned cradle for a baby, so you can rock the baby to sleep. Just another example of a spinning wheel to turn that wool into a cloth. Spin the yarn. This is an old press. Typically, you could maybe put oranges or even make cheese in there, and you press it down, and the liquid comes out from there. So that's just an old press. You put whatever it is you want to get the liquid out of in there, push it down, and the liquid will come out of that into the bucket. Now, in another video, I talked about King George statue, how the colonists tore it down and made 42,000 musket balls. Well, some pieces still remained. There's King George himself, the third, who was not a lot of people in his own country were not starting to like him because of the war, because they had to pay more taxes. But so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. These pictures here, I don't want to go over. Here are some of the fragments of that statue that are still left. So it's kind of cool that those are fragments from the King George III statue that at one point was standing in New York City. Just some examples of flags that would have been used during the war, but I don't want to talk a whole lot about flags, but I want to go to this one. These toys were excavated, which means they were dug up from British Revolutionary War campsites. So where the soldiers stay, we call that a camp. They were found around New York City. They are reminders that the children of British soldiers accompanied the army to America. So we have a toy lamb. Try to zoom in on these. So we have a toy lamb. This one is a toy goose. It's hard to really see from this angle. A toy broom. And then a toy platter, a little plate. So children would often come to these camps. So the people of the British Army. The British Army that landed at New York in 1776 included men, women, and children from across the British Isles and era. They formed a community of their own. Sorry about the dog barking there. Enlisted soldiers typically came from the lower ranks of society. So if you were just a regular, lowly enlisted soldier, you weren't coming from a family that had a lot of wealth. You're probably going to be a farmer, a weaver, a shoemaker. And they were men from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, as well as from other European countries. Like we talked about earlier, the Hessians from Germany. They served for life. When you joined up, that was your job. They served for about 9 pence a day. And today that's roughly equivalent to our money, about $4 a day. Soldiers could marry and have families with the permission of their officers. Approximately 10% of British soldiers in New York in 1776 arrived with their wives and children. And if you were an officer, it means you came from a family that had money. So that's how you would become an officer in the British Army. Here's an example of a British canteen. So this would have held water for British soldiers. And then here are the Hessians that I talked about earlier. King George hired about 20,000 German-speaking troops called Hessians to serve in America during the Revolutionary War. Revolutionary Americans portrayed Hessians as cruel and inhumane, but most of the German soldiers were a lot like Americans. In peacetime, most of them were poor farmers with families. They relied on each other amidst the difficulties of war. Their officers considered themselves enlightened and wrote thoughtful accounts of their American service. So Hessians were there because they were paid, and they wanted to do what they could to make money for their families back home. Here's just an example of some of the different things that they would have wore, a Hessian helmet and different things like that. This also would have gone around the front, around their forehead, this part here. Here's just a fife, a type of flute that would have been used. Now, flutes and drums would have been used a good way to communicate with soldiers on the battlefield. Because with loud drums and their loud noises, cannons, guns, drums can be heard. So they didn't have walkie-talkies or phones, so they had to communicate with instruments. Here is a toothbrush from the Revolutionary War. Of course, it's missing the brushy part, but you can tell where they would have been here. So this is an example of an old toothbrush. There you go. See? Toothbrush. Made from bone. Passenger pigeons would have been used to help feed the soldiers. They were extinct in 1914, but many of these could have been used as times for eating if they needed it. So, and that's something that I already showed you. So I just want to make sure there's no other pictures in this group. that I want to show you that I haven't talked about. So no, that's about all the pictures I want to show you on this one. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. Until later, bye!